Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're watching, listening, logging on in the world, and welcome to the latest Infrastructure Intelligence live event organised in association with our strategic partner, BECG. And today we have the latest in our live in the Spotlight interviews, and I'm delighted today to be talking to Emma-Jane Houghton, who is the commercial director of the new hospital program at the Cabinet Office that is charged with delivering 40 hospitals by 2030. We framed this discussion and this interview as one that was going to be about thinking differently to enable the supply chain of the future. And the reason for that is that Emma is someone who is, as well as being a highly experienced infrastructure specialist with a strong background in executive advisory activity on major infrastructure projects, is someone who is also very passionate about change, about doing things differently, about thinking outside the box, about making a difference within our industry. And I hope that over the next 55 to 60 minutes, that passion and that willingness to think differently will actually come across. In fact, I know it will, because I have actually spoken with Emma in the past. I've interviewed her in the past, and I've always found her to be someone who is straight, as well as being passionate, but also as someone who is very, very interested. And in fact, and I think I said this on social media in the run-up to today's event, we need more Emmas in the industry. Anyway, hopefully you'll agree with that assessment when we get to the end of today's interview. So we've got an hour to have a chat. It's just going to be me and Emma having a chat. Of course, as always, you have the opportunity to post some questions in the chat. So if you do have any, then put them in the chat. I've obviously done a little bit of research. We do that here at Infrastructure Intelligence. And I've got a few questions of my own as well. But if there's anything in particular that you want to ask Emma, then feel free to post it in the chat. If you want to put who you are in the chat as well, in terms of your organization, I'm happy to give a call out to that as well. So anyway, we've only got an hour, so we better get going. Welcome, Emma, to our virtual home. I can see that you're logging on from your home office, which many of us are at the moment. But I'll kick off with a question that I think I might have asked you before, but I'm going to ask you it again. Why are you so passionate about making changes in the way that the industry works?
Well, thank you, Andy. I'm delighted to be back here again, being interviewed by you, and delighted to be back with Infrastructure Intelligence. So you ask about being passionate about making change. Well, yeah, I think that's probably true. But I think before that, actually, I'm just passionate about our industry. Our industry is a great place, full stop. I think it's full of fantastic people. It's full of great skills. And it's full of great ideas. So I'm passionate more generally about the industry. But yep, you're absolutely right. I'm also passionate about making change. And that's because although we already do all of these great things, although we bring together all of these skills to great effect, I think that we have the opportunity to do much better. So if I'm sort of noisy and energetic about the change piece, it's because I feel really passionate that we can be more sustainable, and we can be clearer about the opportunities that our industry presents, and that's really what drives me.
So you're someone, I remember from when we spoke previously, that you were very keen to, I suppose, push the envelope, really, if I could use that phrase, to get people to, as I said before, think outside the box. And obviously at the moment there is a lot of talk in the industry about change and doing things differently. Why do you think that the industry needs a different approach, particularly in the area that you're knowledgeable and responsible for, around commercial strategy and procurement?
Okay, well, I think we need a different response because the current setup is not sustainable. We have an average of contracting margins around 3%. That means that we don't get R&D. That means the industry never really gets traction to sort of move on in modern ways of doing things. So that sort of client-led transactional buying, and what that leads to that sort of lack of investment piece, I find to be a real constraint. So that's the sort of the macro answer. And then within that, the commercial response around how we take things to market is really how that bites and how that enables the suppliers to come forward with their different offers. So for me, procurement and commercial is where it's all made possible. If we don't have the right procurement approach, if we don't have the right sort of commercial setup, then we can't bring the suppliers together in the way that we want for the innovation and the R&D that we desperately need to see.
So you talk there about, there's the current situation hampers the investment that's needed. Why do you think that is? And what could we do differently?
Well, it hampers investment for a few reasons, but as I said, we've got the sort of 3% margin so that we don't have the longevity or the forward view of pipeline to be able to make that investment within those businesses. And then also from a cultural perspective, there's a lack of confidence. There's a lack of confidence in clients as individual buyers. There's a lack of confidence in how that can come together in a collaboration. And so it's sort of very hand to mouth in the way that suppliers are forced to, because they are very effective creatures of that system in the way that they are forced to live and breathe within that. So I think pipeline, I think sensible, sustainable contracting, I think margins that enable that R&D, and then a smarter response from across the supplier base is what would drive that healthier picture in terms of investment for industry. And is what actually would help us to be better on innovation. We are, productivity, we all know the stats, productivity is really low. Every year in the nested tables, we're sort of, I think, second from bottom at the minute near farming. It's still a really poor picture for our industry. And it's not for a lack of ideas or a lack of energy from many, many brilliant suppliers that I know and meet with daily. It's because of the way that we take things to market. We force, or rather, we constrain that picture and we don't make it possible for people.
But it seems to me what you're saying there is that there's elements of the industry working in a certain way because they've always worked in that way, potentially. And also maybe because they've been led to work in that way because the client has actually, I suppose, driven them down a particular route. Now, for me, that speaks about an industry that's actually quite set in its ways. So what would you say to those who say, well, it's all right talking about change and doing things differently, but it's impossible because the industry can't change? We've been having reports about, improving the industry as far back as Egan that I can remember in my time, and there's probably some even before then. And then you obviously had the Armit review and everything else. The industry's just too hidebound to change. What do you say about that?
I say that's just not right. I say that's wrong. We do have reports that go decades back about the change that is desperately needed. But, Latham, Egan, all of these things never really focused on the area of the supply chain that made that possible, which is the way in which clients are perceived, the confidence that clients project, the longevity of that pipeline, and the way in which they buy it. So, there is no shortage of suppliers that I meet with that are jumping up and down for a different way of doing things, that are desperate for change themselves. And as I said before, if for those that believe that there's no impetus for that change from suppliers, it's because they are very effective. In my view, they are very effective creatures of the system that they live in. So they survive in this environment that we have built and that has evolved over a number of decades.
So how do we start to change that then? Because you spoke there about, well, there are suppliers out there who do want to do things differently. And I hear it, we've heard it on many occasions in the events that we've organized about, that frustration amongst some, whether it be engineers, contractors, architects, the whole gamut across the industry, really, and a frustration about the way that they're being forced to work. You're someone who's very much on that client side. How can we get over that frustration and tap into that willingness to change? How can we do that?
That's a very complex question to which there does not exist a simple answer. But some of the ideas, I think, are that it requires a joint effort from suppliers and from clients to work out the art of possible. It requires asking suppliers and the supplier base questions, asking and recognizing and respecting their skill and what they've got to bring to that client need, rather than trying to specify everything up front, because that again constricts the innovation and constricts the ideation that then exists in the way that the market responds, whether that be by supply single, or the way in which they come together in consortia. And I think we need to give the confidence around the pipeline again. And you know that there's some really good headway being made by, I mean, I don't want this to sound like it's all doom and gloom and it's not happening, because there are brilliant steps that are being made in client organisations. We can see things like Anglian Water over the past few AMP periods. They've really invested and shown that there is a different way of doing things. The government itself, as the biggest buyer of infrastructure and construction works, has been investing in a number of fantastic initiatives across the TIP and TIES programme, not least of which is the Construction Playbook, which has had a lot of coverage recently, and which itself is directly correlated to our new hospitals programme. So that this is recognised and there is a concerted effort, but it's not something that we're going to be able to fix overnight. And I think trying to boil the ocean is also a mistake. I think we should have baby steps in trying to get to a broader vision for our industry, and we should be celebrating the achievement of those baby steps as we go.
You mentioned the Construction Playbook there, which was launched, to a ripple of publicity, shall I say? And actually, I'm sure many of the people watching and listening won't have read every line and dot and comma of the Construction Playbook. Full disclosure, I haven't, but I have skimmed through it. And actually, when you read that, I mean, in many ways, it seems to me like a prescription for a much better industry, a better way of working. But how do we actually get people here to even recognise that that's on the table? And also, what about the role of clients in all of this? Because it's clear to me that clients, in many ways, notwithstanding what you said about the need for a more collegiate approach and a partnering approach, and we'll get to that a little bit more detail later, but surely they have a big responsibility in all of this as well.
They do. Well, I'd like to start with, for those that, if you've not read it, if others haven't read it, then you definitely do need to read it, because this will be what we will use for all delivery of construction going forward. It's really what the government is putting its weight behind it. And you know, this itself for our new hospitals programme is a core part of our benefits case. It's a core part of how we will design the DNA of our client model, and it's a core part of how we will take this to market. So I'll have one last go at this. For those that haven't read it, you do need to read it. It's going to be really relevant for new hospitals programme and broader government programmes going forward. And you know, it's excellent. It's excellent because it's been produced in consultation with industry. It's not something that was produced by government in a sort of ivory tower and then released. And it was part of a broader campaign that saw industry impart right elements of it, drawing on all of that good intel that had gone before. Yeah, and you're quite right that it is a client-led approach. It points to sustainable contracting practices for clients. It points to the importance of looking at should-cost models to understand likely outturn. It points to the importance of appropriate risk apportionment and the release of future pipelines, all of those good things that we were talking about just before. If it's not clear, I'm a really big fan of the Construction Playbook.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I mean, as I said, I've read swathes of it. I just haven't read every single word of it. But and as I said, you know, when I ask you the question, I think it is something that the industry needs to not just read, but actually discuss as well. And it's really encouraging to hear you say that the government are going to be taking notice of that going forward, because there's numerous publications and reports, isn't there, that have been produced into this industry, and many of them can be found on, you know, sort of bookshelves and stuff like that. And we don't want that, you know, with this. I've just got a question on, and we're going to have to mention the M word, money, and that is, and Mark Burnley from Wilmot Dixon's put a question in the chat, and he said, whose responsibility do you think it is to move the average 3% margin position, because that is a blocker to the industry evolving? Now, I know that's a big question, and you could give a simple and glib answer. I know you won't, but whose responsibility is that, and how do we get beyond that situation where there's still too much lowest price bidding going on? I know the playbook is trying to get, you know, around that, away from that. What's your view on that?
Well, I think they're two separate questions. So I think in terms of whose responsibility it is, I think it's very much a collective industry responsibility. And we all need to be advocating for a situation where we're not operating with 3% margins, because we all recognise that the lack of R&D is not a sustainable way for us to develop our industry going forward. So it's collective. But I think if we had a hierarchy, then for the most part, that responsibility's got to sit with clients, because as we've been discussing, they set the environment within which suppliers can then evolve and respond. And then to link in and procurement and the way that we procure, whether that is cost-based procurement or whether that is value-based procurement, is a very big part of that. So I think clients must own that value-based procurement piece, which is so critical for how we design, deliver and operate assets and built environment in communities that's fit not just for the initial capex investment, but more broadly, and that it's taken to market in transactions, in routes to market that are more sophisticated than simply just looking at that initial number. We have countless stories, we have countless case studies that prove out that initial focus on lowest cost does not equal a value for money, does not always, equal a value for money outcome for taxpayers.
Okay. So I think what you're saying there is basically it's a collective effort, but obviously clients have actually, have got to be in the lead. But you spoke earlier about, the whole sort of construction supply chain and the need to look at that a little bit differently. I mean, obviously all the people on the call who work in the industry will have their own experiences as a contributor to that supply chain in one shape or form. Mm-hmm. What's your view of the way the current supply chain works and what needs to change in your view?
Well, I think for all of the problems that we've stated, we end up with, we've got a very fragmented supply chain for our industry, which has a number of problems in that fragmentation, but not least of which all of the number of interfaces that then introduces. But the biggest problem actually is that the way it goes to market and then the way that we respond, we get these sort of silo, vertical supply chains that don't collaborate, that aren't sharing ideas. We make some of the same mistakes that we've made before because of that. We're in a contractual world where we're sort of focused on our contractual deliverables rather than the broader client outcome. And it's short-termist and it's siloed and it's blinkered in the way that it comes about.
So how do you change that though? I mean, from your perspective, and I know that in some of your previous roles, you were very passionate and waxed lyrical around the need to change that process, to change those ingrained mindsets. Mm-hmm. Going forward, what do you think needs to happen to actually bring that change that the industry so badly needs?
Well, if we think back to when we first met at Heathrow, when we had that first conversation, I think that Heathrow did a superb job of setting that programme initially up for success, because it put value, social value, that broader, what we understand now through the value toolkit to be the 5 capitals model. It put that at the heart of the policy statement and into the business case. So it was always much more about developing a runway and associated assets for X cost. It was about having a logistics hub. It was about driving local GVA. It was about jobs for local communities. And because that was at the heart of the investment case and why Heathrow was investing that money in that programme, in the communities and in UK as a whole, that gave permission and that gave space to develop a commercial strategy together with those logistics hubs that brought forward that broader value piece. So I think having the permission, the space and the bravery to do broader value-based investment rather than capex cost investment is absolutely critical. And happily, I can say that on the hospitals programme, it's a very similar picture. So it's about that permission and it's about that time and space for it not just to be about the built assets, which of course are super, super important, and that's why we're here, but it is about that broader value piece too.
Well, I'm glad you've mentioned social value, because that's something that, frankly, personally, and collectively here at Infrastructure Intelligence, we're really passionate about. I actually believe that it's key to basically increasing public perception of the benefit that our industry provides, not just in the UK, but internationally as well. I also think it's something that we don't nearly stress enough. People often see the bad side of the construction industry, or the problems that get, that come up and everything else. But every construction project that I've ever seen has made a difference one way or another to people's lives. And particularly some of the stuff that you've been involved in and are involved in, that social value imperative seems to be really, really central to that. Do you think that the industry stresses enough about that value, that social value that's provided by its work?
No, I don't. And this is a topic that drives me nuts. So you're right. We absolutely, an industry full of clever people, clever ideas, loads of energy to make a practical difference to people's lives. And people are doing it every day, but we don't talk about it. We don't PR it. We don't
why not?
advertise it.
I want to get into this a bit, because it does my head in, actually. Because it's there. You can see the benefit, and yet people don't talk about it.
I think people are too modest, because my own view is that there's far too much modesty, because typically the skills in industry are quite logical, they're logically driven. So they're not those skills that are naturally inclined to talk about what's gone really well. There's always a sort of critical approach to what could have gone better, which is great because we need to learn. But we should do that bit, but we should also be showing off about all the brilliant things that we do and the brilliant things that we do think about, because that is essential. It's essential for the culture, and it's essential for the pipeline for people coming forward to actually know that this industry exists. I fell into this industry. I didn't even know that it existed. That was by chance. We need to do more to generate that skills pipeline piece.
Yeah, and I think what you said there about, I suppose the psychology of the people that work in the industry, I think there's something in that, definitely. But I also think as well, I just wish that people, would actually be a little bit more forward in coming forward, if you like, because when you look at some of the projects that get, produced, I mean, I look at them and I walk around and I don't know, maybe I'm just an infrastructure anorak, but I just get a buzz when I see some of the stuff. And then when you look at the good that it's doing to people's lives as well, and it doesn't just have to be a hospital, it doesn't have to be, a health facility, it can be, sort of a new project that's basically opening up a community or whatever it might be. And it really frustrates me that the industry doesn't shout enough about it. And I think, obviously an organization like ours, a website like ours, a magazine like ours has got a role to play in that. But I also I really wish the industry would actually, be a little bit more bolder and, to use your phrase, braver on these issues, because what are people going to say? I just think, someone's put in the chat, interestingly, maybe the industry's got a lot to be modest about, and maybe in some cases it has. At the same time, I think this industry has got a hell of a lot to be proud of as well, because at the end of the day, if we don't speak up for it, nobody will.
I quite agree.
We should be bolder.
We should be a lot bolder. We should be a lot braver. And we should be talking about not only the great things that we do achieve and the great ideas that we've got at the moment, we should be talking about the potential, because in so much as we need to share that internally between ourselves and our teams, our organizations and industry, we need to be talking about that externally. We do very little of that external piece. And I think that's a combination of that cultural modesty. It's probably in part to play that's a legacy position we've come from. But it's also that fragmentation piece too, because there's no obvious sort of one body or one owner of that. And again, I think it needs to be a collective. We probably need a cultural campaign for better collective PR.
Absolutely. You said something earlier, and I want to delve into this in a little bit more detail. You talked about, I suppose, the psychology of people who work in the industry. I don't want to get too deep into the psychology, but you're someone who's come into this industry, and you hinted at it earlier on. I think you used the quote, fell into the industry, basically, but you've entered the industry from a non-traditional background, shall we say. Can you just give us a little bit about that, and almost the Emma-Jane sort of personal credo journey on what got you to where you are now? Bear in mind, we've only got half an hour left.
Yeah, okay. So well, I think you're alluding to the fact that, you know, your sort of fascination with the fact that I'd learned to be a pianist before I became a quantity surveyor. Yeah, okay. So I did music at university. I thought that was a great thing to do at the time. I enjoyed it a lot, but then you sort of leave uni and you go, right, I need to get a job. What do I do now? And then you think, oh, actually, that's not that easy. So yeah, I sort of did that, and then I did fall into construction because I applied for milk round positions and got offered something in London where all the work was at the time. So I moved, because I'm sure you can tell that I'm from Lancashire, moved to London, and I got a job at Terminal 5. And, you know, honestly, it was such a lucky thing, because I've always felt that the construction industry, right from the off of being a sort of music graduate, no idea about anything to do with construction, that you sort of fall into an industry and you meet a range of people who are super generous with their time, really happy to invest in you, really happy. I mean, you're useless when you first start, right? You've no idea how to do anything, but you sit with an engineer or you sit with a planner, a project manager, and this broad range of people that want to help you have utility, want to help you develop those skills. And yeah, I've always felt that I was very lucky that happened. I've always felt that, you know, I've really benefited from that generosity of time. And I suppose in part that probably is what drives this passion for the industry, that I care about it because I felt very cared about when I fell into it.
Do you think that approach is one that's adopted enough? I mean, obviously, from what you're saying, you were quite lucky in having those people, and also there was something in you that was able to respond to that as well. Because I think that's important as well. You know, but do you think there's enough of that going on in the industry?
I think there's loads of that going on in the industry. I've seen that wherever I've worked, and I've worked in major project program delivery, and I've worked in consulting. So I've worked in a range of sectors, and honestly, I can say that no other sector even comes close with the level of generosity of time and interest in people and the development of people. You know, I've worked in pharma, I've worked in construction, I've worked in FMCG, and nothing compares. And you know, and I've seen it on every project. I can think of examples from Terminal 5, working on Network Rail Crossrail, East London Line project, and not just me, I mean, with other people too. You can see that it is I think it's probably symptomatic of a project environment where people come together for a collective good. So you are not only working together in those collective outcomes, but you are working with other people and enhancing that skill set. I'd be interested to know if that's other people's experiences, because it's my own and it is what I see. It is what I see in others too.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting you mention it in that kind of a way, because you know, I know from, you know, the people that I speak to, you know, all the time, whether it be interviewing them, whether it be, you know, doing webinars like this, you know, I've done quite a lot of media training with industry figures in the past as well, and I've always found them all, without exception, to have something to say. And it goes back to what we were saying earlier on about that backwardness in coming forward when it comes to PR and profile raising. Now, I'm well aware, of course, that there are obviously you know, some sort of barriers to being able to just say what you want to say about something, and often that's down to agreements that are signed in contracts and all the rest of it. But I do think we need to actually, you know, get over that, because I think the point that you're making there about how that spirit of generosity, really, because it does rub off. It's clearly rubbed off on you. You can see that from from what you're saying. I just want to and I want to come back to some of the some of the real change stuff you know, a little bit later.
I'd like that, and I'd also like to, if we can pick up a bit as well. I feel quite compelled to sort of make the case for this, that I also don't think there's any other industry where, you know, you'd be lucky enough to be in the mix of such a range of skills. So if I take Terminal 5, my first very lucky experience of a construction project, you know, you're sort of working with HV engineers, you're working with planners, project managers, architects, client side accountants, the range of skills that you can sort of plonk yourself in the middle of and then absorb those different skills and get access to people. I can't think of another environment where you would be afforded that opportunity. And we need to, you know, we should be advertising that as a part of why this industry would be a great industry for young people, apprentices, to join.
Well, it reminds me once again, and I've got my sort of advertising hat on here. You mentioned all the different skills there that make up essentially the construction team. And my mind goes back to an old Dunlop advert on the telly. You're too young to remember it. Sadly, I'm not. And it was two tennis players playing on a tennis court. And it was about the things that Dunlop supplied, basically to enable, this game to go ahead. Anyway, put it this way. The end of the advert couldn't have been shown after the watershed, if you get my drift, because basically Dunlop made everything, and I mean everything. And it comes back to construction for me about there almost isn't anything that is out there that makes us live a sort of a modern, fruitful, sustainable life that doesn't have construction or infrastructure or our industry at its core. And there's something there for me to actually grab hold of. I want to ask you a couple of things about it's partly delving into some of the stuff that you're doing now as well. But I know that you talk about being inspired, and you talk about you're looking at inspiring the next generation and change and all that kind of stuff. You chair the ICE's Engineering Rebellion Group, which sounds like some sort of a mass demonstration or something. Tell me a little bit about that.
I do. Yeah, I check. Well, its official title. Its official title is the Civil Engineer of the Future. So the group, I chair it. The group's been charged by the council to look at what is the future of the civil engineer, recognising that topics like environmental change, digital, and the way that clients want to go to market is actually really fundamentally changed, not just for civil engineers, but the core skills and the professions of our industry. So I've brought together a working group that reports directly to council, and I've sort of put some new faces to the ICE on that board with the support of Nick Baverstock, which has been great. So we've sort of had digital specialists on there, we've had some younger sort of net zero specialists on there, we've had aggregate representation so we can get the front end of the supply chain in terms of quarry. We've had manufacturing, MMC representation, and we've chaired four meetings throughout the year to explore these topics and pull forward our recommendations to council. And the report is, we've pulled together a report. The report is due to go out in a couple of weeks. And because it is so fundamental to how engineering is considered, how it is defined, and what that means for skills, we have termed this sort of working group, we've termed this movement that we hope results Engineering Rebellion.
There's a couple of questions I want to turn to in the chat because I don't want to ignore them, and I'm going to take them slightly in reverse order. First up, Donny McNichol, who is Team Animation and Acumen 7. He said, great to hear what Emma is saying, fully support it. Can I suggest that to make the change, we need to be brave enough to ask in whose interest is it to change? More importantly, in whose interest is it not to change? We need to accept and find ways to deal with self-interest in order to sort of move forward. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very practical, very pragmatic readout. Yeah, and I agree that's a great way to come at it. But I think insofar as we've got to identify, essentially, I think what this person, I missed the name, sorry, this person is highlighting those that wouldn't want to change because it's not in their interest and their business model currently delivers in this way. We need to focus on the impetus to change because we don't need to solve for all of those mini barriers. We need to solve for a new environment and then create the pull that moves people in the direction we're trying to do, in the direction we're trying to go. So I would dangle a sort of big fat carrot rather than worry about some of these little sticks over here.
Again, another question. Edward Moore asks, in your drive for a 21st century commercial response, which includes a higher level of collaboration, do you think that there are any current regulatory barriers that would prevent you from adopting what might be your preferred commercial model, or is it just the ingrained culture that we're having to push against? Any thoughts on that?
I think that's a great question, and I think they are both very relevant barriers. So the regulators play, just thinking about the broader sector piece, this is not specific to health. I'm sort of thinking like highways or network rail or indeed water, power, these different regulators. So I think that the 5-year determination can be a bit of a blocker because the forward pipeline can never be any future forward than the 5 year that is made in that specific determination for that period. So that's a bit tricky. Those regulators, we've looked at this before, those regulators that are outcome focused or functionality focused of the asset base, and those that in particular are advocating for a TOTEX approach and system integration, do far better to encourage a supplier base of collaboration that involves different suppliers collaborating together as well as with the client. The regulators that are more of an issue, in my view, are those that focus on the output spec, because by focusing on the output spec, you're only ever measuring the performance of suppliers based on what you said at the beginning of that 5 years, rather than sort of setting them. I mean, the principles are no different than commercial principles when you contract. You should be asking the suppliers to come up with the stuff that you want at the end of those 5 years, rather than specifying the inputs, because the suppliers know more than we do, and that's the whole point, right? They're the specialists in doing this. To his point about, so that would be my answer on regulation. Ingrained culture, I think that is very tricky to grasp, to form a plan and to transform. Yeah, I think on this, actually, from the previous question, this might be where we need to remove some of those barriers rather than just create the pull factors, because I think some of these legacy cultures in these organisations does make it impossible for these collaborative models to thrive.
So when you say remove barriers, though, and as you say, they are legacy, but how do you remove them? I mean, aren't you there talking about forcing people to work completely differently, or how do you do that practically when it's so ingrained?
Well, you have to rethink what your business outcomes are and what the priorities are and what the operating model that you need to achieve that, and therefore what types of people, what skills of different people, ways of working, the governance that goes with it. And yeah, if those things don't match what you're trying to get to, then you need to make changes. And if that means changing a governance structure or changing the types of behaviours and the types of people that you want in an organisation, then that's what we've got to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting you're talking there about sort of radical change like that, because I mean, it's been said in many different contexts, hasn't it? The last 16 months that we've all had to come through and are still going through has basically maybe put into context, what is possible and what isn't. I mean, who would have thought that, we would have been, all working remotely and still, sort of, working reasonably productively. Notwithstanding the fact that we're all desperate to get back to face as well. 2 or 3 years ago, you just wouldn't have known that. So I think maybe that puts it into context as well. I was just struck by something you said there about the different skills that come around the table, that make up the industry and make up that collaboration approach. Do you think there are new markets that construction needs to tap into? Do you think there are organisation sectors out there that maybe we're not getting the benefit out of at the minute? And if so, what might they be?
Oh yeah, I love this question. Absolutely, I do. So I think that there are existing markets that we need to do a lot more with and that we need to desperately modernise. I mean, if I speak just from first-hand experience at the moment in working with my supplier markets team on the New Hospitals programme, we've been undertaking market analysis to look at the range of skills to create the capacity and the capability that we need for new hospitals. And even in our early work, and I should note actually that our PIN went out yesterday for those.
That's the prior information notice that you're now open for business, as it were, or you're looking to engage with the industry.
That's right, yeah. So the PIN went out yesterday, and we will commence with our supplier markets team a really intense campaign of proper market engagement to listen to suppliers, to help us develop our response to how we want to work with the market, what the solutions are, what ideas people have got, what commercial model will work and what won't. And we will do that throughout the summer. But sorry, to come back to what I was saying. So in the initial work that we've done in looking at markets, even in the markets that we know at the moment, to improve on the ways that we deliver, we're going to need to do a lot more with MEP. We're thinking about calling the MEP market the MEPD market because we want to digitize it more. We want to move some of the processes on from rudimentary manual jobs into an automated approach. That MEP market at the moment, in my from my perspective, in terms of what we've got to deliver, is really weak. We want to be looking at MMC. MMC is absolutely at the heart of new hospitals in how we're going to deliver this massive range in this portfolio. We haven't got anywhere near the latent capacity that we need to deliver on platforms and kitted parts. And then facades would be another one that's cropped up immediately. So that's the, I mean, those are just the markets that we know about already. And that's no different in terms of what we want to deliver. That's just delivering the what bit, but better in a more automated way. Then there are new markets all around digital and all around a new MMC approach that we've not even scratched the surface of yet.
What does collaboration look like to you, and how? I mean, because it's a buzzword. People just say it all the time. We need to collaborate. We need to work together and all the rest of it. But what does genuine collaboration look like to you? And what's your view on how that needs to work going forward to make change?
You're right, it is a buzzword, and it's this sort of thing that lots of people have lots of different definitions of, and it's never especially helpful. But you're asking for my personal view of collaboration. Okay, so I think it's proper collaboration is the coming together of people, skills, brains, ideas for the greater good. And it's got the greater good in mind rather than all the little problems that crop up to make that possible. And I think it's also not being afraid to get it wrong, giving permission for some bits of it to go wrong with the aim of working together for that greater good.
Just on that, making mistakes, I suppose. I mean, obviously construction is a risky business. How do you get around that and still be able to sort of, try stuff out? Because often the contract doesn't allow you to do that. If you're going down a particular route, how do we get over that? How do we enable people to be enabled, if you like?
Well, yeah. So the risk thing is difficult, and it's often a topic we come back to, which is problematic and prevents barriers to moving forward. I think the first thing to say, just to pick you up on your language in your question, I would say we don't get around it. Actually, trying to get around it is what creates some of the problems for us from the off. So we try to get around it. We don't really want to deal with it. We risk dump it in this contract over here. We pretend this bit of it's not happening over here, and then you're on a hide into nothing. So the first thing is we need to stop trying to get around it and just be grown up about it and accept that, yes, it is a risky business because we are building great big assets and we're digging in the ground and there are unknowns and unknowns. So I think that sort of recognition piece, first and foremost, is really important. And then I think we need a much more dynamic way of what I like to call, and we built this into the value toolkit when we designed this last year, the dealing with risk. So I don't always find the language around mitigating risk, like you can sort of do something and it just sort of disappears over here, or managing it, especially helpful. But dealing with risk as an ongoing system is a much more dynamic and agile way to think about how that risk piece evolves as we move through the development and delivery life cycle.
Just coming back to value, because you mentioned the value toolkit there, and it's something we've spoken about at length in some of our other previous events. And Gordon Reed from Cundall's just put a thing in the chat there, and he's talked about there are many guides to social value and many in circulation. Wouldn't it help and encourage improvement if we had a common standard for benchmarking? I mean, that's a question that I'm sure you've heard before. I've heard it before as well, and there's all sorts of different measurements in relation to that. I mean, I'm not even sure how you'd even get to a common standard, although I know the government is actually looking at, in terms of its procurement guidance, trying to move in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, Gordon is absolutely spot on. This is an area, let me first of all say that there is a ton of good work happening in this, and Value Toolkit, as you rightly say, is one of those areas. Government is working hard to draw this together, to get those consistent measures, but I totally agree with Gordon. It's an area at the moment where there's just sort of things dotted around all over the place, and we don't have a consistent means of doing it. It is something that needs to be addressed.
And I'm just throwing in questions at you in a minute because I want to get to them all. Okay. Richard in the chat, he's talking about governance. What do you think about the proposition that poor governance is the root cause of most project failure? We recognise the hugely competent people and businesses we meet daily in our lives in the construction sector. But if you agree that the lack of governance, including risk allocation, and not lack of skills is the cause, then how do we protect the taxpayer? from that? I mean, I know that's a big question, but
yeah, it is a big question. It's a good question. I like it. So look, I've looked private sector and public sector, and I've seen a number of different governance regimes. I would say in public sector, actually, I think we do really well at this because there is more of a GMPP process and a setup that we follow versus some of the stuff that I've seen private sector, which would make your eyes water, frankly. I don't know that. I think the question was about have we got enough? Was it like, have we got enough? I think there's often governance and the stuff there, but for me, really, the question is, does it drive the transparency that we need to see? Is it complementary to the type of decision making that we need, and does it bring the right skills and brains around the table? I think there was a very good report, I'm not going to remember the name of it, something about a thermofrost or something like that, that's not, you know, there's no absence of the sort of chat happening or the work happening at a working level, but then it can't sort of then break through into the boards and get discussed at the right fora. So for me, it's about making sure that the messages are actually discussed in the right places so that decisions can be taken.
And another question, do you believe that there are any current procurement routes which you would see as being a strong benchmark for moving forward, either in, you know, for the hospitals program or anywhere else for that matter?
That's a cheeky question on the hospitals. I won't be drawn on route to market
No.
when we've not announced it yet, but I will say more generally that I think that's impossible to answer that question because the route to market has to be appropriate for the scale and complexity of the investment and the way in which that needs to be delivered.
Couple of quick fire questions from me. One of the things that underpins a lot of this stuff is contracts, the industry's contracts. What's your view on this? Do you think they need to change, or is it just the people that need to change? This is a question that we discussed on an event just the other week there with Atkins, but what's your view on that?
I think the contracts need to, I'm going to sort of repeat what I just said on procurement. The contracts need to reflect the complexity and the risk profile and be very clear about what we are buying. That's sort of contracting 101. I will say actually some of those contracts, some of those standard forms, some of the ways that they are then abused when they are utilized in industry. And I would cite an example of this thing that drives me mental, the NEC suite, with all of its kind of risk management processes baked in, having a sort of 1,000 Z clauses to make it sort of as un-NEC as you could possibly make it. So it's a bit of a rambling answer. I think you need to do your contracting 101 so that the sustainable contracting practices are in place. I think you need a standard form, and I would advocate for less bespoke is better. And I think if you're going to pick a standard form, then you need to stop faffing around with it and keep it in its true form.
One thing that's often touted as particularly a step forward for the industry, particularly on the net zero side, is modern methods of construction and off-site manufacture. Is enough being done there in your view? Because it seems to me that there's been a lot of talk about it, but there's still maybe some organisations who are active in that area who are a bit fearful that they just might not get used. You know, the facilities that they build up and everything else. What's your view on that?
Oh, this is a really good topic. It's a really hot topic for us because MMC is right at the heart of what we're going to do on new hospitals, and it's absolutely essential if we're going to deliver our very challenging programme. So is enough being done? Now, I think there's some brilliant work that is happening with different suppliers, some of whom I am working with at the moment. And I think the MTC, combination of the MTC and the Manufacturing Technology Centre and the Construction Innovation Hub, have done some fantastic work in setting out art of possible and how we do this for industry. So I think we're a really exciting place where we've done a lot of the legwork, we've done a lot of the thinking, we understand art of possible. I think now it's about being brave enough to say, let's do MMC in a way that isn't just moving that process on site into a factory somewhere, which by the way is still a very good thing because it's moving some stuff off site, but that actually moves it some giant leaps forward around let's get DFMA in up front, let's actually do the digital design that makes this stuff possible, let's create a landscape so that we can invest in new ways of doing this platform kit of parts led design. So I think it's a really positive message on MMC, but you know the question for me is, are we going to be brave enough now to kind of like really invest in it and really buy it in the way that will make that big difference for productivity?
You've used that phrase a few times now, being brave enough. What does that mean to you? And what do you think the barriers are to people being brave in the way that you envisage it?
I think that it requires, well, being brave means going beyond what has gone before in terms of a precedence, right? So you have to you have to run with something that's not proven, and then therefore, it's inferred that there's a risk that if it goes wrong, it will be sort of attached to you because there's no precedent. So what a stupid decision that was taken. So I think being brave is about being individually brave. It's about, as a collective, coming together to really look at the opportunity and making decisions based on what we think is good for investment now, but also more broadly for industry. Individual and collective bravery required.
We're sort of running out of time, and there's a few questions I still need to ask you, really. First of all, and I don't want to finish on this because I never want to finish on a negative, but what do you think the biggest barriers to change are in our industry?
Well, we've talked quite a lot about the contract stuff. I think if that doesn't change, that remains a barrier for all of the reasons that I won't repeat. I think another barrier is belief, I would say. I think we don't believe that these things are possible. I think perhaps because we come from a history and a legacy of wanting this change for a very long time and it's not happened, I think there's this sort of lack of confidence in our industry and in the way that we work together that means we think we can't do it. So I think belief as a cultural piece is really important.
Well, that's a leadership issue, isn't it? Belief, because at the end of the day, you might think you believe it, but if you're not prepared to actually go out there and I suppose, sort of talk the walk and walk the talk or whatever it is, then how are you going to then engender that confidence in the people who want to be using your services? So, I mean, you strike me as somebody who doesn't lack belief. And how do we actually bottle that, I suppose? Not how do we bottle you, but how do we do that? How do we get that? And it comes back to this point that we talked about earlier about profile and being brave and all the rest of it. How do we do that?
Well, I think I think if we have a few small examples and we can prove out that it works, it will then, it will then get replicated. So maybe I'm back to my baby steps. We just need a few good wins on this stuff and some momentum, and then I think we'll be off.
So just to sort of round things up, you've spoken a lot about change, about doing things differently. There's obviously people, attending this event and also watching later on YouTube and thinking, oh yeah, I like what she's got to say. How do I engage in that conversation? What would be your advice to them in order to actually, sort of get involved in that discussion?
Well, I mean, I don't have an easy answer to that. I think it's about getting yourself out there, getting involved in whatever you can, bringing positive energy to that change, and joining lots of dots. I mean, this shouldn't sound like there is any lack of great initiatives or ideas or people out there. It's all there. It's just working out how we draw it all together to best effect.
And just finishing off, what would be your message to our industry in relation to what we're talking about here, to to actually trying to do things differently, trying to basically exemplify better value, the difference that the industry makes? What would be Emma-Jane's message to the industry on Friday coming up to lunchtime? What would it be?
I think we should show off more. We should talk more about all of the brilliant things that we do and that we think and that we've got ideas for, rather than focusing on some of the stuff that goes wrong.
Brilliant answer. Great conversation. As always, Emma-Jane, thank you very much indeed for that. And thanks for engaging with the questions as well.
Thank you for having me.
We'll report, as usual, we'll have a report on today's event on our website by Monday. I'm sure this is a conversation that will continue in different guises as we move forward. Really enjoyed talking to you, Emma, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Wish you all the best in what you're doing going forward, and I'm sure the industry will be watching with interest in terms of how that change takes place. Just to give a gratuitous plug, because I can and I want to, for our next Infrastructure Intelligence Live event that we organise with BECG, We've got an event on leveling up, would you believe, that buzzword of the moment, leveling up and placemaking, the importance of placemaking in the leveling up process. That's in a fortnight's time on Friday, the 25th of June. So do join us for that event. I think that's it. The sun's out. It's Friday afternoon. Hopefully it's going to shine. We're told it's going to be really warm at the weekend. So whatever you're doing this weekend, as always, stay safe. And we hope to see you again soon. Thanks very much to Emma-Jane Houghton for her time this morning. And thanks to you, the audience, for watching and listening. Thanks very much indeed. Goodbye.
Bye.